special guest needs only a very small introduction, and that is our 16th President of the United States.
Thank you, Katie. Is this how you use this? All right. Thank you very much. You know, this is only my second time in Michigan. I was here in this fair state back in 1856. Oh, you remember? Well, maybe not. I was down in Kalamazoo. I had come to stump for the first presidential candidate of the newly formed Republican Party, John Fremont, the Pathfinder, from his exploits out in the West in California. And I spoke to them there and had, just a marvelous time. But if you were there, you might not have recognized me, I must say, because I wasn't sporting any whiskers at the time. And you might notice that they've gotten a little gray. That happens when you're 213 years old, really. You know, that recalls to mind how I grew my beard. You may know the story, but let me share it with you. I think I have the letter here. I keep some of my most important correspondence in my hat because my desk is a mess. Some of you know what that's like, perhaps, but here's what a little girl wrote to me back in the time when I was running for president. Let me see here. Her name was Grace Bedell. She lived in New York, upstate New York, and this is what she writes. Honorable Abe Lincoln, dear sir, my father has just come home from the fair and brought home your picture with Mr. Hamlin. You remember Mr. Hamlin? Maybe not? Well, is my running mate, Hannibal Hamlin from Maine. Those vice presidents, sometimes we forget about them, but we can't. Anyway, she continues, I'm a little girl, only 11 years old, but I want you to be president very much. So I hope you won't think me very bold to write to such a great man as you are. Have you any little girls about as large as I am? And if so, give my love and tell them to write me if you can't answer this letter. I've got 4 brothers, and part of them will vote for you anyway. But if you let your whiskers grow, I will try to get the rest of them to vote for you, because you would look a great deal better. For your face is so thin. All the ladies like whiskers, and they would tease their husbands to vote for you, and then you would be president. My father's going to vote for you, and if I was a man, I would vote for you too. I'll try to get everyone to vote for you that I can think of. That rail fence around your picture makes it look very pretty. I've got a little baby sister. She's 9 weeks old, just as cunning as can be. When you direct your letter, direct it to Grace Bedell, Westfield, Chautauqua County, New York. I must not write any more. Answer this letter right off. Goodbye. Grace Bedell. And my response to dear Grace, Springfield, Illinois, October 19th, 1860. Miss Grace Bedell, my dear little miss, your very agreeable letter of the 15th is received. I regret the necessity of saying I have no daughters. I have 3 sons, one 17, one 9, and one 7. They, with their mother, constitute my whole family. As to whiskers, having never worn any, do you not think people would call it a piece of silly affectation if I began it now? Your very sincere well-wisher, A. Lincoln. Well, as you can see, that silly affectation did appear. And when I went to my inaugural, I stopped in Westfield in Chautauqua County to thank Grace for her suggestion. So I tell children when I have a chance to see them, they should write the president. You never know what might happen. On my way here, I stopped off stopped off in Kalamazoo, got off the train and walked over to Bronson Park, where I had first come to Michigan, as I mentioned. And I noticed they had a historical marker there. And so I stopped to read it. And it said, in describing me, that I was an obscure lawyer from Illinois. Oh, Mary, my wife, would laugh at that. Because, you see, when I ran for president, the folks out east, they thought for sure that she and I lived in a log cabin and we had dirt floors. In fact, they sent a photographer out in order to see exactly where we lived. And so we showed them our nice, commodious home, recently added a second story for the growing family, and had just a wonderful visit. Obscure lawyer indeed. You know, I have some really good memories of Springfield. That's where we raised our family. I remember one day I was out pulling little Robbie and Eddie, our first two boys, in a wagon, and I was just walking along, and as was my custom, I often had a book in my hand. It's so nice that you have so many books at hand here. You know, you are blessed. Books were harder to come by when I grew up. Well, I was reading a book and I was lost in thought, and I was halfway down the street from our house when a neighbor hailed me and said, Abe, you lost one. And I turned around, and sure enough, little Eddie had fallen off about half a block back. We went back and picked him up, and I don't know if Mary found out, but she was always scolding me for not paying closer attention. You know that historical marker I mentioned in Kalamazoo? You know, it said something else about me that I kind of want to take issue with. Sometimes when folks look back in history, they might not remember it correctly. And there was a line in that marker that said, some of the listeners that heard Lincoln speak that day thought that he was soft on slavery. Well, you may know that I was born in a slave state in Kentucky. Oh, we were the farthest things from slave-owning families, though, being among the poorest of the poor. We did move across the Ohio River to Indiana when I was 7, just at the moment in 1816 when Indiana became a state. But my first real experience of slavery came when I was just 19. Let me tell you about it. I was living in Illinois at the time and had gotten to know the Gentry family. Alan was a very good friend, and his father had asked him to take a flatboat down the river loaded with supplies and to take it to market down all the way to New Orleans. And he needed someone to go along with him, and I was a strapping 19-year-old eager fellow, and I went along to help Alan. We made it all the way down that great river. We sold the goods that we had on the flatboat, and then had a day before we headed back on the steamboat. And we were wandering in that great city, just amazed at all the things we saw, and the buildings, and the variety of people, and suddenly we were in a great crowd that seemed to be moving in one direction, and it picked us up almost like a body, and we went with them. And suddenly we found ourselves in a big square, and there was a big platform, and on it were a crowd of enslaved people, families. And one after one they were brought up. People examined them, poked and prodded, all kinds of indignities, and then we watched as children were sold from parents. Mothers were sold from children. Husbands and wives split and sold in different directions, all attendant with wails and cries to no avail. The most inhumane thing I had ever witnessed. I went back with Alan as quickly as we could and booked our passage on the steamboat, and I remember looking over the rail as that muddy Mississippi River went by, and I said to Alan, thinking about what we saw, if I ever get a chance to hit this thing slavery, I'm going to hit it hard. Soft on slavery. Well, time passed. Mary Todd became my wife, and we started our family in Springfield, where I had my law practice. But our nation became more and more divided on this issue of slavery. I did spend one term in Washington, D.C., representing our area in the House of Representatives. Oh, let me tell you about what happened in that race. It's a story about a preacher, and stories about preachers can be really fun. What happened was we were both stumping for the House of Representatives seat. We had a good crowd like this, and we were both up on the platform, and it seemed like my opponent, Peter Cartwright, who was a Methodist circuit riding preacher, had gotten a little bit more into preaching than into a speech. And he was haranguing the crowd, and I was sitting right in the front seat. And he said to them, all of a sudden, with a flourish, pointing a finger at the crowd, "Who here wants to go to heaven? Please stand up." And everybody stood up. But me. I was in the front seat, crossed my legs, and stayed put. He leaned over the platform, pointed at me, and asked, with the crowd standing expectantly, "And Mr. Lincoln, where do you plan to go?" Seizing the opportunity, I stood, faced the crowd, and said, "To the House of Representatives, please." And indeed, it was so. But you know, it was so disturbing serving in our nation's capital that when I walked to my lodgings, just a half a mile from those hallowed halls of liberty, there was a slave market, not unlike the one that had sickened me in New Orleans. In fact, Washington, D.C. was one of the greatest markets for the selling of human souls. And yet in the shadow of the Capitol, built and dedicated to freedom. Maybe you've had some feelings like that even in this day and age. Well, fast forward. Our founding fathers had seen slavery as an evil and hoped for its eventual extinction. But more and more voices from the South were insisting that slavery was a positive good. They tried to convince folks that the black persons enslaved had it better in slavery, that they were happy, that it was the right thing and it was ordained by God and not a gross injustice. They resented those of us in the North who encouraged freedom seekers to find their way north through the Underground Railroad. But in the Compromise of 1850, in the passage of the Fugitive Slave Act, they made it so that all of us in the North, under penalty of law, had to help apprehend those who had escaped. And so you in Michigan and we in Illinois became slave catchers by law. And that we couldn't abide. I'm glad to know that in Michigan there were those who stood resolutely against the law. Yes, for what was right in a higher court. Well, fast forward to 1854, I was busy with my law practice. We had added to our home, as I mentioned. We had our 4 boys. Well, no, we had 4 boys, but in 1850 we lost Eddie. I don't know if any of you have ever lost a child, but it's a searing experience, soul-shaking. I found some solace in the local Presbyterian pastor, and we became good friends. It was so hard on Mary to lose a child she had borne. But also in those years, news came to us that Stephen Douglass, who was our senator in Washington, had authored an odious act called the Kansas Nebraska Act that really changed everything and awoke many of us out of a kind of dogmatic slumber that we had not really known how dangerous things had become. You see, this Kansas Nebraska Act basically thinking about how to bring new territories into the nation, which generally had excluded slavery, like the Northwest Ordinance that said no slaves could be held in Ohio or Indiana or the states that came out of that Northwest territory. But what he proposed was that territories could vote for themselves. They could decide, do we want slaves or not? And so it became a great contest where people came from the South armed to the teeth, and those from the North as well, and there was almost a civil war over it. It threw aside the compromises that had been made, the lines that had been drawn that said no, slavery can go north of this line. And then if that weren't enough, 3 years later in 1857, the Supreme Court, the highest law in the land, declared in the Dred Scott case that slavery could be everywhere. If you don't remember the case, let me just tell you, Dred Scott was an enslaved person brought into Illinois, which by our law in Illinois states that if someone enslaved is brought there for a period of 6 months, after that time they can be free. He was, after that time, taken back to Missouri as an enslaved person, and so he, being a person of understanding and ability, sued for his freedom. And it went to the Supreme Court. And Judge Taney, the Supreme Court Justice, Chief Justice, handed down the opinion that Dred Scott had no standing in the court. Because, and listen to this, he was not a person. He was property. And our Constitution had been established to protect the property from undue and unlawful seizure. And so all of us who were against the extension and expansion of slavery suddenly realized that those who held that odious institution could come and live anywhere under the protection of the highest court in the land. Well, something had to be done. Something needed to be done, and how could I do it? I thought, I'll go back to Washington. I'll go back this time to the Senate. And so I campaigned to be the senator from Illinois taking the place of Stephen Douglass. And you might remember, we had some pretty good debates all up and down Illinois in that fall of 1858. I remember particularly, well, it was always interesting. Great throngs would gather to hear us. Thousands of people would be gathered. And Douglass would come in on his special train, wonderfully appointed, with his entourage. I'd come in a buggy with a few followers. But once we stood on the platform together, that's when it really happened. And people were hanging on every word. I remember one time, Douglass, after he had his hour's harangue, before I could stand and speak mine, he ended by saying that I was two-faced, saying one thing one place in Illinois and saying another thing in another place. Not principled at all. I was two-faced. So when I stood up, I began by leaning over closely to those in the front of the crowd, and I said, do you really think I'd be wearing this face if I had another? But the real division that separated us was that I believed that the enslaved were persons, human beings. What's the line? Endowed by their Creator with inalienable rights, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Isn't that what we believe? But the distinction was that the little giant, as we called him, posited with Taney and the Supreme Court that slaves were property, like furniture, like cattle, and so could be taken by their owners wherever, disposed of, however, and had no right to speak up at all. That I stood unalterably against. Well, what I said made it all around the nation in our papers. Douglass, however, was voted back into the Senate by the Illinois legislature. You see, back in those days, it didn't trust the people to vote for senators. It was done by the legislatures in the state capitals. They voted in the senators. I'm glad you get a chance to put your word in now. But he was sent back to the Senate. But now, I, who had been considered for the vice presidency back when Fremont was the candidate, I, who had been a candidate more than once for the United States Senate, I received an invitation, a momentous invitation from New York City. Now you see, and maybe you understand this because you live in Michigan, there is a bit of a separation between the East and the Midwest. And there were folks, not unlike those who thought that Mary and I lived in a log cabin with a dirt floor, who looked at us as rather obscure country bumpkins. And although I had spoken the length and breadth of Illinois in these debates with Douglass, and what I had said had been carried around in the newspapers of the nation, I had not had opportunity to speak in the midst of those Eastern intellectuals. And I was invited to speak in New York City by a group of young, aspiring political leaders. I was going to speak in Brooklyn at the famous church of Henry Ward Beecher. Beecher was known because in the midst of the Civil War in Kansas, he sent some Bibles. Well, they were called Beecher's Bibles, but inside there were rifles. It was part of that terrible, terrible Civil War between American citizens, all because of this Kansas Nebraska Act. Well, anyway, I was invited to go to his church to speak, and by the way, he's the brother, rather, of Harriet Beecher Stowe, and I'll talk a little bit more about her later. But as interest mounted in my coming to New York City, there wasn't going to be enough room in his church, and so they rented Cooper Union so that we could have a bigger crowd. And I'll remember that February 27th, 1860 rather, just a few months before the presidential election, I went to Cooper Union to speak. I know when I stood up, a lot of the journalists and even many in that 1,500 crowd looked and shook their heads. He was a gangly looking guy, hardly the kind of statesman we might wish to hear from. His homespun attire didn't look quite as dapper as some. And did you see how he folded and unfolded those long legs? It was almost comical. But once I began to speak, all of that was forgotten. And by the time I had ended, there were huzzas and the waving of hats and handkerchiefs, and everyone was on their feet. You see, what I had said in a closely worded and researched argument is that our founding fathers did not want the extension of slavery, period. Even though the South was depending on those who had gone before to give them backing for what they wanted. In fact, I pointed out that 46 of our 51 signers of the Declaration of Independence were slave owners. 46 of the 51 who signed our Declaration of Independence were slaveholders. Nearly every one of them was opposed to slavery and wanted it eventually extinguished. I don't think they knew how. They may not have had the ways in which their society could allow them to do that, but they were clear on the principle. In fact, Thomas Jefferson, when originally drafting our Declaration of Independence, had in it words about how odious and how wrong slavery was. But it got taken out in the discussions about what we would put in that founding document. And so I told them that dehumanizing slavery was an evil that even those who founded our nation wanted eventually not spread, but extinguished. The full force of my argument against the extension of slavery was heard, and rallying the nation, I won the election in the fall as the 16th President of the United States. But as I went to Washington in March, I faced a daunting task probably equal or greater to the one Washington faced in birthing our nation 80 years before. After my inauguration in March, I'll never forget how vulnerable we felt there. Sitting there in Washington after the firing on Fort Sumter in the beginning of the hostilities with the Confederate States, troops were gathering just across the Potomac and threatening the White House and the Capitol, and I called for the governors of our states in the North to send troops as soon as they could. It wasn't much longer after that, a month, hardly that I looked out the window of the White House and I saw glinting in the sun the bayonets of those soldiers marching down Pennsylvania Avenue from the train station in the Capitol, coming to the White House to salute the president. And I looked out and I found out where they were from, and I turned to Mary and I said, "Thank God for Michigan." Your governor heard the plea first, organized the regiments first, and sent them first to defend our nation against those who would betray our principles. The next year, though, was so dark and difficult, 1862. It was doubly dark for Mary and me. For you see, in February, we lost Willie to typhoid fever. I can still remember at his bedside watching him breathe his last, and Mary inconsolable, now a second child lost. It was all I could do to follow that small casket to its resting place. Mary couldn't even go, couldn't even leave the White House. 1862 was such a tough year. And in the summer, I became more resolved to hit this thing hard. In whatever I could do as the chief executive of our nation. I couldn't change the Constitution. I couldn't take away property without some due cause. But as the leader and commander-in-chief of this effort of war, I could make it more difficult for the Confederacy to continue the fight. And so I knew that if I could free their slaves, it would be much harder for them to continue, or it would give hope to those in bondage. What really had helped change some of my urgency and my focus was meeting a couple people who came to the White House. First was Frederick Douglass, and you maybe have heard of him. Such a brilliant orator, far greater than what I might humbly say. he traveled the North and talked so movingly about his time as an enslaved person, about his escape, and then about abolition of slavery as an institution. He came and we talked in my office on the second floor of the White House. And as we talked, I learned that his grandparents were born in America. And his great-grandparents and parents before them. I had thought, among many, that what was the solution in our problems with the race difficulties in our nation was that as the enslaved persons were freed, they could be sent home to Africa in a colonizing effort. But what I realized that day with Frederick Douglass is that I was wrong. His family had been here longer than the Lincolns. This was his home, not to mention the blood, sweat, and toil to create the wealth of our nation, albeit not sharing it. And so he helped my resolve. As did that little lady, Harriet Beecher Stowe, that I mentioned before. You know, she, when I met her, it was rather interesting. When I saw her, I said, "Oh, so you're the little lady that started this big war." Now, seriously though, she wrote what galvanized the nation. She wrote a story called Uncle Tom's Cabin, in which she detailed the horrors of slavery, particularly the selling of families and the separating and the cruelty of so many masters. She, though, was assailed, particularly by those in the South, as making it all up. In fact, as I was coming here, I read a local paper, and I read something about fake news. I don't understand. Except that it was what they were saying she did. She was making it all up. And so the very next year, after she published this bestseller that went around the world with its interest to learn more about this pernicious and evil institution that we held in the bosom of America that claimed freedom for all, she wrote The Key to Uncle Tom's Cabin, a nonfiction work to point out how she got all of the material, the true stories that were behind the novel. Well, I had some pretty good borrowing privileges at the Library of Congress. I think it's kind of nice when you have that ability. I hope your president doesn't abuse those privileges. I kept the key to Uncle Tom's Cabin a little longer than I maybe should have. I took it up with me to the soldiers' home. That's the White House was so hot in the summer. Have you ever been to Washington, D.C. in the summer? It's so humid, malarial almost, and to be healthier, Mary, just Tad then. We just had Tad. Yeah, it's so hard to even think about. Tad, yeah, little Thomas. He was called Tad because he had a big head like a tadpole, and he always was wiggling. Oh, such a delight of our lives. But anyway, she would pack up Tad, and they would go up to live for the summer. They're just about 2 miles up from the White House in a nice grove of pines, and it was a beautiful place to get away from it all. And I would then ride up after my duties were done each day. Sometimes I'd try to slip out, just ride up alone, but usually I had a few folks, so maybe 200 cavalry, so follow me or something. But I when I get up to the soldiers' home, I had that peace and that quiet and that reflection. And it was while I was there and while I was reading The Key to Uncle Tom's Cabin, I became more and more resolved that I could do something, and decided what that would be. I could make a proclamation, as is the right of a president. And I could make a proclamation about the slaves held by those in rebellion that could affect the course of the war. That was my right, without Congress or the courts. And so I put pen to paper, and I wrote the Emancipation Proclamation. I shared it with my cabinet and I got mixed reviews. They were pretty much for it, but they weren't quite sure that it was the right thing to do, but I was adamant. I'm grateful that William Seward, my Secretary of State and close friend, you know, some of you may remember, although most of you probably weren't there in 1860, that William Seward was assumed to be the nominee for the Republican candidate for president. He was from New York, after all. I mean, he was significant in the nation in ways that I was not, and it seemed that he would be the one. But maybe because the convention was held in Chicago and I was close at hand, but anyway, he was not nominated, and I was. And so, what do you do with your rivals, like Seward and several others that lost out in that race for presidency? Well, I thought the very best thing to do with those rivals is to put them on my cabinet. I always thought that it's better to keep an eye on somebody than just let them loose. Well, it turned out that William Seward and I became close friends, like brothers. And I trusted his counsel, and he cautioned and said, Mr. President, I don't think you should release this Emancipation Proclamation now because we're having such a hard year. Losses are piling up. It's so difficult. We're not sure what the future might hold, and people would see this as a last gasp, seizing at straws, maybe a drowning man. And so I heeded his counsel, and I held off on signing it, or rather issuing it. And he said, let's wait for a victory. And that September there was. It was a costly victory. The Battle of Antietam in Maryland. The most Americans who died ever in our history in one day. But the South was repulsed, and it was seen as a victory for the Union. And the next day I issued the Emancipation Proclamation. And it gave the South 3 months to lay down their arms, or I would sign it into law as the executive. Also, at the same time, the Congress had been opening the door to black enlistment. And this went hand in glove with what I was preparing. And do you know that among the freed blacks and the enslaved who found freedom, 180,000 persons joined the Union Army. 180,000. By the time the war ended, 40,000 gave their lives for a freedom that probably meant more to them than any of us. Well, January 1st came, 1863, and as is typical, on the New Year's Day, we throw open the doors of the White House and we let any and every one come and greet the president. After all, it's your house, and I'm just occupying it for a spell. So I stood and shook hands all morning. I stood and shook hands all afternoon. And by the time we closed the doors and I went up to my office to sign the Emancipation Proclamation, I picked up the pen off my desk and my hand shook uncontrollably. I set the pen back down and said to those around me, I am not about to put pen to paper right now and let anyone think that I was uncertain or afraid to sign this proclamation. And so, after a little while, I picked the pen up and with steady hand and firm resolve, I signed the most important document I ever wrote. I'm glad to say that the tide turned that summer of 1863 by On July 3rd, we heard from the little village up in Pennsylvania that Lee's army had been repulsed there at Gettysburg after a 3-day bloody battle. The very next day, General Grant sent word to us that Vicksburg, that linchpin on the Mississippi, had finally fallen, and we now had cut the Confederacy in half. That November, I traveled by train up to that Pennsylvania town, which had seen so much bloodshed, to dedicate a cemetery for the fallen. I wasn't really the speaker. I was the president, so they were going to let me say a few words, but the speaker was none other than the most heralded orator of the nation at the time, Edward Everett, dean at Harvard University, and he was eloquent. And he spoke for 2 hours. And then I stepped up and made my little speech. I'd like to share it with you. I think I had my glasses around. You know, it's sometimes difficult when you get old. Oh, there they are, right where they were. Sometimes that's where you find things. Right where they were. Imagine yourself there. A battlefield, still freshly overturned with all those many men who fought and died and struggled. 77 years ago, our fathers brought forth upon this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. Now we are engaged in a great civil war, testing whether that nation or any nation so conceived and so dedicated can long endure. We are met on this great battlefield of that war. We have come to dedicate a portion of the field as a final resting place for those who gave their lives that the nation might live. It is altogether fitting and proper that we do so. But, in a larger sense, we cannot hallow. We cannot consecrate. We cannot dedicate this ground. The brave men, living and dead, who struggled here have consecrated it far above our poor power to add or detract. The world will little note nor long remember what we say here, but it can never forget what they did here. It is for us, the living, rather, for us to be here dedicated to the great task remaining before us. That from these honored dead we take increased devotion to that cause for which they gave their last full measure of devotion. That we here highly resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain. That this nation will have a new birth of freedom. And that government of the people, by the people, and for the people shall not perish from this earth. I really appreciate a chance to come back to Michigan. And one of the reasons that it's especially meaningful to me is that not far from here, in a little cemetery that I believe someone had pointed out as I was coming on the last part of my journey, Fairplanes Cemetery near the city of Greenville, there are 2 black Civil War soldiers who are buried. Part of the 40,000 that gave their last full measure of devotion for a new birth of freedom. I also have learned from others that have told me that there's a couple dozen more scattered around this area who fought in this great Civil War as black soldiers for a new birth of freedom. I did hear that for some of them, they just now, within the last couple years, cut a marker on their grave. So let us remember that there is unfinished work to do. We carry within us the seeds of that declaration that everyone is created equal and all are entitled to inalienable rights. It's up to us every day to give a new birth to freedom. Thank you.